All right, welcome to the Capital Budget Subcommittee. We have, I think, 6 or 7 agencies today. We'll start with the Department of Natural Resources. Andrew Gray is our analyst. Welcome in, Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now present the Department of Natural Resources Capital Program, PAYGO Capital Program. As you see on page 1 there are 11 programs in the fiscal 23 request. In terms of the PAYGO recommended actions, Dls recommends deleting the $6.2 million or so in general funds for the Natural Resources Police Replacement Helicopter and concurring with the other PAYGO funding in the governor's fiscal 23 budget, and then approving all of the authorizations in the governor's fiscal 23 budget and general obligation bond funding. In terms of the transfer tax, Exhibit 1 reflects the big picture. There's overall around $362 million for the programs reflected here. And that reflects a couple of different things. First of all, it reflects the regular allocation of the transfer tax funding. The revenue estimate has increased since last year. Therefore, there's a more additional funding coming through the formula. It's $283 million total there. There's overattainment funding from fiscal 21. So that's money that was in excess of the revenue amount that was estimated for fiscal 21. That's now applied 2 years later to fiscal 23. So that's $48.5 million reflected here. It also goes through the formula. And there's also $30.5 million in the dedicated purpose account in general funds as well. And that's reflected in terms of the allocation noted there. Exhibit 2 reflects the transfer tax revenue estimates changing over time. As you see here, not only is there a larger amount relative to last year, but then there's also an increasing amount of revenue coming in estimated for the transfer tax as well. And then that translates to the programs reflected here. The 21 estimate looks a little bit weird because there's an overattainment money from fiscal 21 being applied. Exhibit 4 reflects the program open space fund balances on the state and local side. And just note here, the unobligated funding doesn't mean that there's no money left at all. Or, I'm sorry, there's money that could be completely transferred to the general fund in terms of it's not allocated to a project. It just means that there's particular projects have been applied to particular funding that's available there. So this is the overall picture, though, in terms of the balance for the program open space fund. In terms of Exhibit 5, Department of Natural Resources Capital Program funding, this reflects the big picture in terms of the funding of the next couple of years. Just like to highlight the general funds reflected here in fiscal 23, that's for the helicopter and also for the critical maintenance program as well. Exhibit 6 reflects the big picture in terms of the actual program funding. You notice the big increase in special funds for program open space land acquisition and local program. You see here the Oyster restoration program also reflects an increase in general obligation bond funding, and local parks and playgrounds infrastructure program level funded at that $85 million over 2 years. And finally, on the far right here, there is the funding for the Natural Resources Police Helicopter Replacement, that's general funds. Just highlighting a couple of programs. The critical maintenance program receives $37.6 million in the fiscal 23 allowance. That's around $12.6 million in transfer tax special funds and $25 million in general funds. Budget is part of the $100 million in general funds in the dedicated purpose account. And that funding has not been allocated explicitly, but the agency does have a list of projects they would like to use that funding for. In terms of the Oyster restoration program, the budget includes $13.6 million, a significant increase relative to last year, but this is part of the overall plan to basically to provide for the 6 major sanctuaries that are being rehabilitated by the state. In terms of those sanctuaries, Harris Creek is completed. And then the other 3 sanctuaries noted here are in second-year class seatings. And finally, the Minokan River Sanctuary is the big one in terms of additional work being done. And you'll see the overall cost being reflected here. In terms of the local parks and playgrounds infrastructure program, very successful program, $85 million designated for that purpose in fiscal 22. The governor's brought in an additional $85 million for fiscal 23 to level fund that program. A slight change in terms of how the funding is being allocated. General Assembly had allocated that funding by jurisdiction. The governor is coming with around $9.9 million of specific target projects. And then the remainder, around $75 million or so, is then unallocated and then would be allocated based on applications received by the Department of Natural Resources. In terms of the big picture in fiscal 22 funding, the overall amount is around $46.8 million has been encumbered at this point, which is excellent. The idea was for shovel-ready projects to really get moving with that funding as part of the stimulus during the pandemic. And so you're seeing a number of counties do have all of their funding, or at least part of their funding allocated. 6 counties have not allocated any of their money yet. 2 of those are the largest counties, Montgomery County and Prince George's County, and they have specific projects they need to use that funding on. In terms of other things to see here in the chart, one thing to note is that Frederick County has 28 projects. It's the largest number of projects for its particular allocation of funding. But then Garrett County seems to be the most equitable in terms of how it's allocating the money across different projects, or the 10 projects that it has in its complement. The Natural Resources Police Replacement Helicopter Project, around $6.2 million in the fiscal 23 allowance and some general funds. And we replaced the 52-year-old Bell OH-58 helicopter with a new helicopter to basically as a force multiplier for maritime homeland security, conservation enforcement, and search and rescue operations. DNR knows that there are a number of enhancements in terms of what basically it's less expensive to operate this helicopter than the state police helicopter. So not going to the state police for missions is very important. Their existing helicopter, unfortunately, has been down for at least 6 months due to the procurement of parts issues during the pandemic. And generally, it's at the end of its lifespan, it really needs to be retired. The question is, does the Natural Resources Police really need a new helicopter? Does its work require that in terms of being able to do search and rescue? Are there other entities out there that can do the search and rescue actions as well as, or without the Natural Resources Police involvement? Will the Natural Resources Police be able to actually be able to bring people off the ground, or will they only be able to direct other searchers to where those people need to be rescued? In terms of the maritime homeland security, thank God we have not had any major homeland security concerns that I'm aware of. Question is that because of the Natural Resources Police unit's aviation helicopter? It does not appear so, at least for the last number of months when they haven't had a helicopter up there. Therefore, the question going forward, do we need it for that purpose? And then also in terms of conservation enforcement, they do note that it helps with jacklighting and in terms of also looking at endangered species. The question is, if we haven't really seen a huge uptick in those particular crimes, and the question obviously, of course, are we doing enough monitoring to find out? If we haven't seen a big uptick, is the helicopter needed for that purpose as well? So perhaps the agency can speak to those particular issues. In addition, the Board of Public Works did have a cost containment action back in July 2020 to zero out funding for at least a portion of the program. It was noted as kind of eliminating the program, and it does not, once again, has not been up in the air, the current helicopter, for a number of months. Therefore, Department of Legislative Services recommends that the helicopter be decommissioned, the current helicopter, and the funding for the replacement helicopter be deleted. In terms of the first issue, this concerns the first and only issue that concerns the Maryland Park Service enhancements in the budget. So a little bit of background: last fall, the State Park Investment Commission met to discuss all things park related. Great Maryland Outdoors Act has been brought in the Senate Bill 541 and House Bill 727 in the 22 session to address a number of needs in the park system. Just want to highlight here in terms of the capital side of things, the idea really is to eliminate the critical maintenance backlog, which hopefully by around the end of fiscal 26. So just a couple of years, really put a lot of money towards that effort to get the critical maintenance backlog down to zero. In terms of other actions, it's around $64.8 million for that critical maintenance backlog. So therefore, it's a bit of a heavy lift, but there's a certain amount of money in the budget, and then also in the bill, it's those bills that noted as well to kind of help address this. And also consideration, of course, that they're going to need to do a lot of inventorying and managing of their assets in order to be able to make sure they understand what's actually out there and the condition of those assets to then be able to kind of resolve the critical maintenance backlog issues. Dls recommends that DNR comment on the ability to eliminate the critical maintenance backlog by fiscal 26 and the steps that it's taking toward improving its asset management. Moving now to the end of the analysis, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, for the great analysis. Any questions for our analyst? I don't see any, so we're joined by our agency secretary, Hadaway Riccio, my old committee mate. Are you with us? There you are. Great to see you, Madam Secretary.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. For the record, Jeannie Hadaway Riccio, Secretary, and with me today is Alan Fisher, Deputy Secretary, as well as Bunky Luffman, our Legislative Director. I want to start by thanking the Department of Legislative Services and Mr. Andrew Gray for the analysis, and we appreciate the opportunity to respond to the findings and the recommendations. So beginning with the PAYGO recommendations, we strongly oppose the recommendation to delete the $6.2 million general fund appropriation for a replacement helicopter. The July 1 Board of Public Works decision was made in the middle of an unprecedented pandemic when revenue estimates were projected to be much lower. Once greater revenues were realized, our operations of our aviation unit resumed within 3 months. So once we have the ability to obtain a new aviation unit, which is absolutely critical to the mission of DNR, our mission will be much the same as it is today. As many of the committee members are familiar, NRP has operated an aviation unit for over 60 years. The current unit is 52 years old. It was built in 1970, and it has already exceeded its life expectancy. In fact, Bell Helicopter no longer supports the frame or manufactures replacement parts. As the committee members can see in our written testimony, the primary objectives of our aviation unit include search and rescue missions, enforcement of natural resources laws, serving as the lead agency for maritime homeland security on state waterways. And I'd also like to point out the vastness of NRP's jurisdiction, which means an aviation unit is the only way to effectively patrol and search. We're responsible for 7,700 miles of shoreline, including the Chesapeake Bay and Maryland's Atlantic coast, and over 500,000 acres of state-owned land, not to mention privately owned lands when we're doing those search and rescue missions. So I respectfully request that the committee reject the DLS recommendation and retain the funding for the replacement helicopter. The department concurs with PAYGO recommendations 2, 3, and 4, and asks the committee to support those recommendations. We also concur with all 4 GEO bond recommended actions and ask you to support those as well. Regarding recommendation number 2, our department is working with the Department of Budget and Management to fine-tune the local parks and playgrounds infrastructure language to ensure that the eligibility criteria is consistent with last year's LPPI program, as well as program Open Space Local. Finally, DLS asked us to comment on the critical maintenance backlog. We're very grateful for the governor's leadership in allocating $37.6 million in funding for critical maintenance in FY23. We believe that this amount will be a significant help in addressing the backlog of projects on our state lands, and it's consistent with the workload that we can reasonably achieve. Our engineering and construction unit is filling vacancies and will be fully staffed by this fall. And while we've made significant effort already to reduce the critical maintenance backlog, that progress will be accelerated once engineering and construction is fully staffed. I would just point out that given the fact that new projects are constantly added to the critical maintenance list, and given the uncertainty that can occur during procurement and construction, we can't guarantee that the backlog will be entirely eliminated by July 1, 2026, but we do believe that it will be significantly reduced by then. We are also in the planning stages with Maryland Department of General Services to utilize a statewide contract for a computerized maintenance management system, otherwise known as CMIS. CMIS will create a detailed inventory of our facilities, the maintenance history of those facilities, and our future needs. So again, we would ask the committee support in retaining funding for all of these important programs. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, for the thorough response. Are there any questions for the agency? I don't see any. Thank you, Madam Secretary. We do have a number of people signed up to testify. I will remind witnesses that we have 2 minutes in this committee, starting with Eric Galley. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to see you and everybody here today. I will be very quick. My name is Eric Galley, and I'm here on behalf of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and the Nature Conservancy. And hopefully you all got our consensus document titled Targeted Funding Opportunities for Clean Water, Climate Mitigation, and Resiliency. And we just wanted to make it clear, this is a multi-year, multi-agency document, but we're trying to pitch this in the agency briefings where it's relevant. And in this case, if you have the document, I would urge you to scroll down to number 4, the 100 acres of oyster bars. A lot of the projects on here, and again, it's multi-year, are basically building on what's already going on. There are very good things that the agencies are doing, and we're trying to supersize the very good things that they're doing. So we're already doing this Oyster work. What we're proposing is an additional $40 million over the next 3 or 4 years, so they can even do even more acres. And that would get us closer to meeting our 2025 WIP goals. So we would urge you all to take a look at this document. Remember that it's multi-year, it's not crazy, it's multi-year, and it's multi-agency. And we want to continue working with everybody to see if between the surplus and the federal infrastructure money and maybe a revised version of the Build Back Better plan coming down in a few months, but even if without it, with the surplus and the infrastructure money, if maybe we can fit some of these things in and get closer to some of our goals. And with that, I wish you all a good afternoon.
Hey, Mr. Galley, any questions for CBF? Delegate Rice. You're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry about that. Thank you. With this additional money, you're talking about expanding oyster sanctuaries with that. Is that, did I hear that correctly?
Well, this is, I don't know, but technically, I don't think it all has to be sanctuaries, but this is about restoration and sanctuaries, but we are actually talking in sanctuaries, I'm sorry. So this is about expanding. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's more sanctuaries, but just going deeper and doing more acres.
Is the reason why I was asking the question is that many of the sanctuaries that we have now, I mean, we have dead oysters sitting in them because, as you know, with they're silting over. And oysters do have a, they only live a certain number of years anyway, then they die. Because we don't have that constant turnover in these oyster sanctuaries. What I'm understanding is that they haven't really been all that effective, and I don't know that expanding these sanctuaries is really the right use of money. I mean, I understand what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, obviously, oysters are the best filtration system in the Chesapeake Bay. We want to encourage that, but we also don't want a bunch of dead oysters sitting on the bottom either.
Absolutely. You know what I'll do is I'll get the CBF scientists to get you some information.
Perfect. I appreciate that.
I don't want to speak for them. I would sound like an idiot if I tried to speak for them.
Thank you.
But we'll get that information for you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
If you get to the subcommittee, we can disseminate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions for CBF? All right. Well, thanks for your great work. Appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
Charlotte Davis, Partners for Open Space.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. I'm Charlotte Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Rural Maryland Council, but I'm here as co-chair of Partners for Open Space. We're a statewide coalition of environmental, agricultural, recreational, and historic preservation organizations, and we're here in strong support of Governor Hogan's proposed budget for fiscal year 2023 for program open space. I don't think we need to tell you the COVID and the pandemic proved how popular our state's parks are. They greatly enhance our quality of life, and they support our rural economies and economies across the state. We think this is our, it's a national tool for program open space, and we just ask that you keep the formula, keep the funding. It's politically popular with Maryland residents, and we just ask that you support the budget as introduced. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your service and testimony. Any questions for Partners for Open Space? Thank you very much. Mel Poole, Friends of Maryland State Parks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mel Poole, Friends of Maryland State Parks. 5,000 volunteers and 40 partnership organizations annually contribute 200,000 hours valued at $5.7 million to the Maryland Park Service. These volunteers provide expertise and diversity to the state park workforce and service park advocates to the surrounding park gateway communities. We advocate full funding for the governor's 2023 program open space appropriation. Please do not cut the Maryland Park Service's critical maintenance and capital improvement budgets. These funding sources allow the Park Service to fulfill its mission of visitor enjoyment and resource preservation for 75 state parks and 140,000 acres of public lands. We support the governor's appropriation of $37.6 million for critical maintenance for the FY23 budget, but we don't see how these projects can be completed in a timely manner without increasing the staffing capacity of DNR's engineering and construction services and general services acquisition services. For the FY23 budget, the backlog has grown to $76.6 million. from 40 million in 2018, a 91.5% increase. Given the current inflation rate, we expect the backlog in real dollars will probably exceed 100 million. We also support the governor's appropriation of 30.2 million in the Natural Resources Development Fund for capital improvements for the fiscal 23 budget, although this funding remains inadequate given the current existing infrastructure. State parks generated in 2021 $17 million in visitor fees, $25 for every $1 invested, and 1.3 billion in economic impact. We believe that state parks are a good investment and urge full support for the DNR capital budget. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your advocacy. Any questions for this witness? Seeing none, I think that completes the witnesses. Everyone else I have listed as written. So unless I hear someone, all right, we can move on to our next budget item, which is the IAC. Laura Hyde is our analyst. Welcome, Ms. Hyde.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Try that. Okay, there you go. If you were looking at page 1, this is, again, I'm Laura Hyde for the Interagency Commission on School Construction. This is page 1, capital budget summary. With the passage of Chapter 20 of 2020, the Build to Learn program funding for school construction eclipses $1 billion for the second consecutive year. This funding includes 8 programs that receive a total of $222 million in GO bonds, $257 million in PAYGO general funds, and $40 million in PAYGO federal funds, and revenue bonds issued by the Build to Learn program. On page 6, this is Exhibit 1, new construction, school construction by source. This chart shows new school construction, not including revenue bonds applied to the Build to Learn projects. This proposed budget uses almost equal amounts of PAYGO general funds and GO bonds as new school construction funds. PAYGO federal funds are applied to the Healthy Schools Facility Fund, which receives $40 million in both fiscal 22 and fiscal 23. On page 7, this is Exhibit 2. Chapter 14 established the Maryland General Assembly's intent that the state public school construction funding program should annually meet or exceed $400 million. The intent of Chapter 14 is that programs such as Build to Learn and 21st Century Schools are intended to supplement but not supplant state funding. As programmed in the fiscal 2023 CIP, the state funding level falls short of this goal by approximately $100 million in each of fiscal years 24 through 26. This deficit is primarily due to the funding allocated to the public school construction program, in which the governor's CIP is reduced in response to planned issuance of Build to Learn bonds in these years. Moving to page 9, Exhibit 4, this is public school construction program funding. In December 2021, IAC made fiscal 2023 75% funding allocations totaling approximately $156 million on the governor's preliminary $208 million budget as outlined in the preliminary capital budget. Based on the proposed CIP in February 22, the IAC revised initial 75% allocations to $166 million and added another $124 million as part of the 90% proposed allocations. 100% recommendations are preliminary and total the fiscal 23 allowance of $285 million. Allocations for fiscal 23 cover approximately 47% of requested funds for school construction. Now looking on page 10, this is Exhibit 5, Enrollment Growth and Relocatable Classroom Supplemental Grant Program. The fiscal 2023 proposed budget provides mandated $40 million for EGRC, plus an additional $55.4 million. Starting in fiscal 22, Chapter 20 reduced the threshold of 5-year average relocatable classrooms from 300 to 250 for LEA eligibility and added an enrollment growth provision for any funding allowance over $40 million. Under this revised formula and with the increased funding in the proposed budget, 7 counties receive EGRC supplemental grants in fiscal 23. This is page 11. We're on Exhibit 6. This is the Healthy School Facilities Fund. The proposed fiscal 23 allowance of $90 million for healthy school facilities exceeds the $40 million mandate established in Chapter 20, with $50 million in GO bonds and additional $40 million in federal stimulus funds. Baltimore City receives 50% of any fund allowance, including federal funds. On page 13, this is Build to Learn bond issuances. Chapter 20 authorizes the Maryland Stadium Authority to issue bonds to finance school construction projects. The first series of bonds was issued in November 2021, and a second issuance is planned for March 2022. Currently, IAC is planning for approximately $608 million, but this chart shows that the MSA has projected that as much as $786 million could be available for school construction in the first two bond sales. Also, looking at the bottom of this page on Exhibit 8, these are allowances and allocations for Build to Learn, using a projected allowance of approximately $2 billion, as you can see down here. In January 2022, approximately $395 million has been approved for Build to Learn projects in 6 counties. This projected allocation leaves approximately $1.6 billion for remaining projects, which will be dispersed using the statutory percentages seen in this chart. Local governments must provide their local match for all Build to Learn projects, and cost share percentages apply to the whole project, including planning, design and development, as well as furniture, fixtures, and equipment. And all projects must be approved by the IAC. Turning to page 15, this is Exhibit 9, Baltimore City Revitalization Bond Issuance. Chapter 647 of 2013 established a new partnership between the state, Baltimore City, and Baltimore City Public Schools to fund up to $1.1 billion in public school facility improvements through revenue bonds issued by MSA. $974 million in par value has been issued to date, and according to MSA, there is an additional $126 million in capacity to issue bonds. MSA plans on issuing the new bonds in early calendar 2022 with a par value of $68 million, which will fund one additional school construction project. Exhibit 10 is on the Aging Schools program and shows that distribution. And Exhibit 11 is the non-public Aging Schools program. Again, the distribution for fiscal 20 and 21. On page 18 is the Public School Safety Grant Program distribution for 21 and 22. And then the next exhibit is 13 on non-public school security improvements. I just want to note that the public and non-public school safety grant programs do not receive funding in the capital budget in fiscal 23, but they do receive a total of $13.5 million in general funds in the operating budget. Turning to page 21, this is exhibit 14. This graph shows that the standard deviation of the age of school buildings starting from the statewide average of 24 years old in fiscal 2005. This graph shows that the current average age of school buildings in the state range from over 40 years old in some counties, while other counties have an average that exceeds the statewide average of 24 years by as much as 11 years. The final exhibit on page 23 shows IAC's new maintenance assessment ratings by LEA. I just want to point out that DLS concurs with the PAYGO allowance and the GO bond allowances and suggests restoring language from the fiscal 2022 capital bill for the non-public Aging Schools program. This ends my presentation and I stand for questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hyde. Great presentation. Any questions for our analyst? You don't mind just turning off the, okay, I don't see anyone. So we can turn to the agency. Chair Casemeyer is with us. Mr. Chairman, I think you were here. If not, then Mr. Gorell, I think, can handle it.
Thank you, Chair Barnes. Chair Casemeyer was not able to join us today and sends his regards. I'm Bob Gorell, Executive Director of the Public School Facilities Program here in Maryland. I've got with me a few of my staff members. I'd like to introduce Cassandra Viscara, Deputy Director for Administration, Alex Donahue, who's Deputy Director of Field Operations, Arabia Davis is our Funding and Programs Manager, and Fred Mason has joined us. He's Chief of School Facilities Branch of MSDE, and he'll be available to answer questions. Before we respond to the analysis, and thank you, Laura, for always doing a great job, we want to tell you a little bit about the big things that we've been doing here at the IAC in school construction. We've been busy putting these funds to use through improved support of LEA planning and project management. Arabia will begin our presentation with an overview of FY22 school construction funding and initiatives. Arabia?
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon. In fiscal year 2022, the IEC approved 91 projects, including 36 major construction projects, 2 kindergarten projects, and 53 systemic projects with a state share of almost $370 million through the Capital Improvement Program, including funding added on through the Enrollment Growth and Relocatable Classroom Program. The IEC also allocated an additional $105 million that included $40 million in federal ARPA funding through the Healthy Schools Facility Fund to projects that improve the health of Maryland's school facilities. This program funded more than $18 million to correct unreliable or insufficient air conditioning, $31 million to correct unreliable or insufficient heating, $5 million for temperature regulation, close to $40 million for roof projects, a little more than $1.1 million to address lead remediation. Funding was also provided for indoor air quality and window replacements. A survey of the LEAs recently conducted by the IEC reported that 98% of public schools in Maryland have air conditioning systems, and this is up from only 78% in 2004. Currently, 21 of 24 school systems report air conditioning in all of their classrooms. Only Baltimore County, Baltimore City, and Garrett have schools remaining. There are currently 27 schools that have classrooms without air conditioning. These LEAs report that within 3 years, the number will be reduced to only 10. 4 are in Baltimore City and are used only as swing space and are planned for disposal. 1 is in Garrett and may not need air conditioning due to the climate and the geographical area. 5 are in Baltimore County, but the vast majority of classrooms in those schools are air conditioned. The county reports that after 3 years, only 9 classrooms and 5 schools will remain without air conditioning. Now I will turn it over to Alex to talk about the Built to Learn program.
Thank you, Arabia. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. The Built to Learn Act took effect almost a year ago, and the IAC and Maryland Stadium Authority have been working diligently since that time to implement its requirements. On July 23rd, 2021, the IAC and MSA approved a program memorandum of understanding as required by the law. Following that MOU, the IAC has been reviewing and approving projects which occur on a rolling basis rather than annually like the IAC's other programs. Including approvals made at its February meeting, the IAC has approved more than $670 million in projects for funding through the Built to Learn Act. And now Cassandra will respond to the budget analysis recommendations.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. You, of course, received our written testimony. I won't repeat what we said there. DLS made 5 recommendations in their analysis, and the IAC concurs with all 5. With that, we stand for questions.
All right, well, thank you for your responses. Are there any questions for the agency? I don't see any. Thank you all for being with us today. I don't believe there are any witnesses on this. Everyone is either with the agency or written. So we can move on to the Department of Aging.
Thank you, Chair Barnes and members.
Good to see you, sir. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for your good work. Grace Peterson is our analyst. Ms. Peterson, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my pleasure to present the Department of Aging's fiscal 2023 capital analysis. The department requests $2.4 million in fiscal 2023, and DLS recommends to approve this amount. There are 3 projects proposed for fiscal 2023 for senior centers in Queen Anne's County, Baltimore County, and Coward County. Each project proposes to increase the programming space for these senior centers that serve a growing aging population in their jurisdiction. Exhibit 3 on page 5 provides an update on ongoing projects. And what's notable here is all of these projects have not seen expenditures, but most of them have seen encumbrances, except for the Harford County Senior Center project, which is experiencing delays, but the Baltimore City has now taken over administering that project, and the department will bring forth the authorization for this project once revised plans are made. DLS has one observation to share, and it's increasing investments in the intergenerational model of service. So this really involves bringing more than one generation together in a community center, as opposed to the senior center model, which would really only serve older adults. So in prior project justifications, the department has indicated there's benefits to the intergenerational model, such as it could remove stigma felt by some visiting a standalone senior center. And it also makes the financing of creation of open programming space more feasible as it serves a wider population. So looking at Exhibit 4, this lists all the state's investments in intergenerational centers going back to 2019. And what's notable here is over 80% of the state's investment in intergenerational centers over this time has been provided through bond initiatives instead of through the Senior Center Capital Grant Program. The Senior Center Capital Grant Program offers a number of oversight benefits that are not available through bond initiatives. So DLS recommends that consideration be given to potentially increasing the funding ceiling, as that may be a limitation in why more projects aren't receiving their funding through the Senior Center Capital Grant Program, as these projects receive funding through bond initiatives instead of the grant program. The state's oversight is limited for these projects, but investments have not been. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson, for the great presentation. Are there any questions for the analyst? Don't see any. So we'll turn to Pamela Seidel. Sorry.
No problem. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the committee. My name for the record is Pamela Seidel. I'm Chief of Staff with the Maryland Department of Aging. As noted in our written testimony, we do concur with the recommendation and have provided responses for the discussion items. I'm available for any questions if any of the members have questions.
Any questions for the Department of Aging? All right, moving right along. Thank you for being with us, and thanks for your work for our state.
Thank you for your time, and thank you, Grace, for your analysis.
Let's move to the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. Madeline Miller is our analyst. Welcome.
Hello, thank you, Chair. I'm going to now share my screen. All right. Today I'll be presenting the Maryland Department of Emergency Management's capital budget. This is the first capital hearing for the department in front of this committee. The department was created this past fall on October 1st by Chapter 287 of 2021. There are two components which I will be addressing today. The first is a construction project recommended for funding in the CIP, the headquarters renovation and expansion. The fiscal 2023 request for this project is approximately $9.1 million in general obligation bond funding. I'm going to jump forward to page 3, where more detailed information is provided about the department's headquarters, located on the Camp Frederick Military Reservation in Baltimore County. This project first appeared in the Military Department CIP when the Maryland Emergency Management Agency was located there. Since the facility's construction in 2001, the now MDEM has taken on a variety of additional responsibilities and outgrown the aging space. In addition to the department's expanded programming scope and personnel, poor roofing and groundwater infiltration has resulted in the presence of mold in the HVAC system. The renovations and expansions will provide staff with improved office, conference room, restroom, break room, and billeting spaces. Building spaces are required to accommodate staff needs during emergency activations. Renovations will also address the HVAC system and repairs to the parking lot. The project is expected to cost $23.1 million in general obligation bond funding, and the department reports that construction is expected to begin in July. In addition to the fiscal 2023 funding for this project, pre-authorizations are provided in the capital budget bill for fiscal 2024 and 2025. The $10.3 million fiscal 24 pre-authorization for the project is required so that the Board of Public Works can approve the construction contract without the authorization of all funds necessary to fund the contract. DLS recommends approving GO bond funding for the headquarters project in fiscal 23 and approving pre-authorizations for the project in fiscal 24 and 25. Flipping back to the cover page, there's also 25 million in PAYGO general funds for the Resilient Maryland Revolving Loan Fund. Last year, 25 million of GO bond funding was authorized for this revolving loan fund. The current Maryland Consolidated Capital Bond Loan deauthorizes those funds, however, and replaces them with PAYGO general funds. This program will provide low or no interest loans to local governments and nonprofit organizations to fund local resilience projects and satisfy the non-federal match for federal mitigation grants. The fund was established in response to the passage of the Federal Safeguarding Tomorrow Through Ongoing Risk Mitigation or STORM Act that authorizes FEMA to provide capitalization grants to states. The program has been scoped following the best practices provided by the Maryland Department of the Environment, which manages a water quality revolving loan fund. DLS asked that MDEM update the budget committees on the program's activities to date and its planned activities in fiscal 22 and 23. The Department of Legislative Services recommends concurring with the use of PAYGO funds and approving the deauthorization of fiscal 2022 GO bond funding shown further down on this page. That concludes my analysis, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Miller, for the presentation. Are there any questions for our analyst? Don't see any. Let's move forward with Secretary Strickland, I think is with us. Here you are. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Barnes and Vice Chairman Chang. Subcommittee members, thank you for having me here today. As it was mentioned, this is our first inaugural event with the new department. And a very special thank you to our analyst, Madeline Miller. I also have other members of our staff here. Chaz Eby, who is our deputy, is with us. Janet Moncrief, who is our director for mission support, which handles our facilities, and then Jeremy Scheinecker, who is our facilities manager. We have submitted written comments and basically concur with everything that the analyst has provided. So I'm really ready to answer any questions that you may have and any special interest you might have with this project.
Concurring with the analyst is good. Any questions for the secretary? Okay, well, thank you, sir. Thanks for being with us. I don't see any witnesses. So we can move on to DHCD. Emily Haskell. Ms. Haskell, welcome back, is our analyst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll share my screen. Again, my name is Emily Haskell, and I'll be presenting the capital budget analysis for the Department of Housing and Community Development. This chart shows the Capital Improvement Program, or CIP, for DHCD by year. As you can see, funding for DHCD's 14 capital programs in fiscal 2023 increases significantly compared to fiscal 2022. And general funds are used in place of general obligation bonds for almost all programs, with the exception of $3 million in GO bonds for the Shelter and Transitional Housing Facilities Grant Program. The overall increase in funding is partly due to the availability of federal funds for broadband, but also due to one-time increases across many of DHCD's capital programs, particularly homeownership programs and neighborhood business works. Notably, this chart does not include funding from supplemental budget number 1, which had nearly $80 million in PAYGO federal funds for homeowner and business assistance in DHCD, which I'll talk about later. Excluding broadband and other federal funds from the American Rescue Plan, funding for all other DHCD programs increases by $34 million compared to the current year appropriation. This page shows the Dls Recommendations, which are to concur with the allowance for PAYGO, approve the 1 GO bond authorization, and also approve the deauthorization of $9 million in GO bonds in fiscal 2021 for broadband due to the availability of federal funds. Exhibit 1 shows a comparison of this year's CIP with last year's for the 4 years of overlap, excluding broadband. This year's CIP is about a third higher. However, it's important to note that the CIP rarely reflects the funding level for DHCD's programs. Exhibit 2 shows the proposed allowance for state funds. It shows that the proposed allowance for state funds has exceeded the planned amount for the last several years by about $40 million on average. And then funding is generally further increased through legislative actions. Homeownership programs see the biggest increase in fiscal 2023, with funding going up by $16 million to a total of $42 million. This increase is funded partially with higher special fund revenues, but there's also an increase of $5 million in other state funds. Exhibit 4 shows the recent increase in activity in DHCD's homeownership programs starting in fiscal 2020. In fiscal 2021, the Maryland Mortgage Program was used to finance nearly 4,000 mortgages, and the capital appropriation supported down payment assistance for more than 3,000 households. DHCD is also administering the Homeowner Assistance Fund that was created through the American Rescue Plan. Maryland received nearly $250 million for the program, all administered by DHCD. Exhibit 5 shows DHCD's plan for allocating these funds, with 77% going to grant and loan programs for low-income households. The loan portion is in DHCD's capital budget, with $67 million in the current year appropriation and $65 million that was added through supplemental budget number 1. And applications for the grant and loan programs opened this past December. Funding for rental housing programs totals $67.5 million in fiscal 2023, which is level with the current year. Last year, the department submitted an assessment of Maryland's housing needs, and Exhibit 6 shown on the screen was part of that report and shows that the shortage of affordable housing units is particularly acute at the lowest levels of income of less than 30% of the area median income. DHCD's rental housing programs typically fund projects that provide housing for households up to 60% of area median income. Exhibit 7 shows the rental housing units created and preserved through DHCD funding. Increasing construction costs have been a factor in how many units the funding supports, and DLS has asked the department to comment on the impact of rising costs on projects financing and on the mix of new units produced versus preserved with the rental housing appropriation. Next, I'll turn to the state small business credit initiative. Maryland is receiving nearly $200 million from the American Rescue Plan to provide access to capital for small and underserved businesses through this program. This funding includes a set aside for businesses owned by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, as well as an incentive allocation that can be used after achieving goals for lending to those businesses. The supplemental budget included $21 million in PAYGO funds in DHCD for the program, which will be jointly administered by DHCD Commerce and TEDCO. DLS has asked DHCD to comment further on the plans for this funding, including how it's expected to be divided between the 3 agencies. DHCD also administers some disaster relief funding, mostly through Neighborhood Business Works. Previously, the department provided loans to businesses in Ellicott City impacted by flooding, and in January, the Board of Public Works authorized forgiveness for the outstanding loan balances. In October, DHCD also received $3.8 million from the catastrophic event account to provide grants to both residents and businesses impacted by Hurricane Ida. As of February, only 6 businesses had applied for a total of $300,000. DLS has asked DHCD to comment on the anticipated timeline for making grants and when any unused funds are expected to be returned to the catastrophic event account. Lastly, I'm going to talk about broadband, and some of this will sound familiar for those of you who are also on HSS, as this issue also appeared in DHCD's operating budget analysis. For both operating and capital, the state has allocated $400 million from the American Rescue Plan for broadband programs across the fiscal 2021 to 2023 budgets. And DHCD is also expected to receive at least $100 million from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The fiscal 2023 allowance includes over $170 million in PAYGO federal funds in the dedicated purpose account for broadband. And in fiscal 2022, there's a negative deficiency in the dedicated purpose account to shift some funds to fiscal 2023. But there's still about $200 million available in fiscal 2022 for broadband across the dedicated purpose account and DHCD budgets. Exhibit 8 shows all the different broadband programs DHCD is administering, many of which are new in the current year. The top portion of this chart is primarily capital programs, while lower down, the affordability and adoption programs are funded in the operating budget. Connect Maryland on the first line is the largest component of DHCD's broadband initiatives and funds the construction of new networks to large unserved areas of the state. The fiscal 2022 application window for this program closed with over $250 million in requests, which are now being reviewed. DHCD expects to announce the awards this April, and depending on the amount awarded, may decide not to open a separate round of applications for fiscal 2023. On the third line, you can see a new program to provide service to residents of public housing with $45 million provided in fiscal 2022. This funding will be awarded to local jurisdictions and is expected to open for applications soon. Jumping ahead to Exhibit 10, This exhibit shows funding that will be available from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for broadband. The largest pot of money is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or BEAD, which has a $100 million minimum for each state and will primarily fund larger infrastructure projects. The next program is the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant, which has a state minimum of $1.5 million annually. The program will include an initial planning grant for states to develop plans to ensure internet access for disadvantaged populations. The next few programs are competitive grant programs for both digital inclusion and infrastructure projects. And the last program is a federal monthly subsidy for households' broadband bills, which Dhcd is currently supplementing through the Maryland Emergency Broadband Benefit, funded with $45 million in the current year's operating budget. Finally, Exhibit 11 is trying to get at the need for broadband programs across the state, reflecting both lack of infrastructure as well as other access issues. It shows a rough map of the state with the percent of households with no internet access based on results of the American Community Survey. Chapter 74 of 2021 charged the Office of Statewide Broadband with creating a statewide plan by July 1st of this year to work toward ensuring all Marylanders have access to affordable and reliable broadband by 2026. The office is working with Salisbury University and the Eastern Shore Regional GIS Cooperative to develop the plan, as well as completing the mapping needed to better understand the needs across the state. And these maps are expected to be available later this year. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Haskell, for the great presentation. Any questions for our analyst? All right, I don't see any. I think Secretary Holt is with us and his team. Or if not, his team is here, so you can take it away. And
we're here. Secretary Holt is.
There you are. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair. Appreciate it. You referred to Emily's presentation as great. You're absolutely right. It's a great presentation. She does a terrific job. With me here is our Chief of Staff, Robin Choconus. Our legislative support is headed by Hunter Pickles here right on my left, who you all know and work with on a regular basis. Abdul Silla, who's our acting director of our Division of Finance and Administration. And then we have an additional group spread around the table here available to answer any questions. I'm first going to call your attention to a series of maps that are attached to the written documentation in the budget presentation. There are 27 maps. These maps, I think, will be of interest because you can drill down into each of your districts and see the amounts of money that have been provided by both the federal and the state across a variety of different programs. Our Community Development Administration, Neighborhood Revitalization, the Office of Statewide Broadband, our Opportunity Zones, and the COVID relief. So these 27 maps are extremely relevant to each of the counties and jurisdictions that you represent. With respect to Emily's recommendations, we concur with all of her recommendations and appreciate her support. She raised three questions that I will address here. The first one relating to cost and inflationary increases. Basically, our programs provide about $2.5 million in gap support to make all of our multifamily construction projects work and price out. We believe because of inflation, that will have to increase by roughly $1 million to $1.5 million for each of our projects. We have about 70 projects in the pipeline. So if the increased cost is $1 million to $1.5 million, we're looking at between 70 million and north of $100 million of additional costs associated with this inflation. We believe that each one of these projects are worthy, and we strongly encourage the support of our budget and any kind of supplementals that may come down and address this. With respect to the SSBCI, the State Small Credit Business Initiative, we have partnerships that we formed, Department of Commerce, TEDCO, and there's community development finance institutions called CDFIs that work with disadvantaged communities and disadvantaged businesses. And those CDFIs will also be sub-recipient partners. the breakdown, roughly $187 million with some incentives to reach about $198 million if we accomplish those additional incentives. The Department of Commerce will receive approximately $42 million. The Technology Development Corporation, TEDCO, will receive approximately $47 million. And our department will have approximately $93 million to address business demands across the entire state. We believe that we have, through our Neighborhood Business Works, the experience and the capacity to rapidly deliver this money. It will be delegated out over 3 tranches. These tranches will basically be a third of the federal appropriation issued, and then we will spread it out across our partnerships. Once that money is expended at about a rate of 80%, then a secondary tranche will be issued and a third tranche will be issued. We have a plan submitted to U.S. Treasury. It was the first plan submitted by any state in the nation, and I think we are fundamentally guiding the U.S. Treasury in how to appropriately establish this kind of program. With respect to the question about disaster relief through the Catastrophic Event Fund, we have determined at this point that the 6 applicants across 3 counties, Anne Arundel, Cecil, and Montgomery, will not, in fact, need the $3.8 million. The business applications totaling just around 275,000, we don't see additional applications coming from that area. However, there will be residential applications, and at this point, we don't know what construction costs are, and we don't know what the insurance claims will cover. So we will, in fact, return some of the money to the Catastrophic Event Fund. We don't know exactly how much, but we're prepared to return any unused funds. So with that, I hope I've addressed the questions that the DLS analyst has raised, and we're eager to answer any of your questions from the committee members.
All right, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for the responses. Are there questions for the Secretary or his team? I don't see any. Thank you, sir. There are a number of witnesses. Claudia Wilson-Randall, you have 2 minutes. Welcome.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm happy to be here, and I will make it short. I know my colleagues from the Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition, as well as partners across the state, will be speaking after me. I just want to generally support the allocations in the capital budget. And specifically, I just want to make sure that you hear the urgent need for money for rental housing programs across the state. Those costs are going up as we are talking. It is really critical. The Maryland Housing Needs Assessment was completed in 2021. It is really critical that we continue to build units. There's an urgent need for units, particularly at 50% or below of MAMI. And I just want to make sure that the request for an additional $32 million gets put in our requests. We also put in there that the Baltimore Regional Neighborhood Initiative, that's capital funds, but we want to make sure that there's a corresponding increase in the operating budget for operating funds. The Baltimore groups are really struggling to deploy that capital without operating funds. Shelter and transition, basically the state is passing through money from the federal government for shelter and transitional, but we would love to see the state actually put money, $1 million into shelter and transition. And we also want to see an increase to put capital money into the Maryland Community Action Agencies. That is a critical safety net as we recover from the COVID pandemic. And we'd like to see an equitable recovery across the state. You have my written testimony. I really appreciate. Again, my name is Claudia Wilson Randall. I'm from the Community Development Network of Maryland, and I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for the work that you do. We'll take questions for all of these witnesses at the end. Frank Hodgetts, Home Partnership. You have 2 minutes, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. Barnes, and members of the committee. My name is Frank Hodgetts. For the record, I work with a group called Home Partnership. We're a community-based nonprofit affordable housing and community developer, and we work in the area of the Upper Chesapeake region. I'm here before you today to urge your support on the capital budget for the Department of Housing and Community Development, essentially because we work in the rural areas of the state of Maryland, the Eastern Shore, including Cecil, Kent, Queen Anne's County, and Harford County. And I can tell you, having used these funds in the past, these are critical funds for our projects, which help people who are under 60% of the area median income in many instances, and sometimes middle income folks. An awful lot has been happening in rural areas, and I would urge your support. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this time. I would be happy to accept any questions at the end. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, sir, and thanks for the work that you do. We have Miranda Williams, Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition.
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the committee. My name is Miranda Darden-Willems, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition. The coalition includes 185 member organizations that use DHCD financing to build, own, and manage affordable rental housing communities across Maryland. I'm here today to support the governor's proposed budget for DHCD's rental housing programs, but also to ask you for an increase of at least $33 million, which would get us up to $75 million, to provide additional gap funding to the many projects in the development pipeline that are struggling to get to closing due to rising construction costs, higher interest rates, and lower tax credit pricing, all increases that affordable housing project budgets simply cannot absorb. And you'll hear more details on this from Willie and Jessica. I want to quickly just share with you the success of Rental Housing Works. We are celebrating a big milestone this year. It's the 10th anniversary of the program, which has been used to finance now 105 properties, which includes 11,500 housing units in 19 counties across Maryland. Your $233 million investment of state dollars in this program has leveraged over $2 billion in other funding for affordable rental housing over the last 10 years. So we thank you for supporting this program over the last 10 years. It has really been money well spent. There are currently 53 more RHW applications for shovel-ready projects that are under review at DHCD, and they just cannot move forward until more funding is available for the program. So we know there are many competing priorities for funding this year, and we ask you to please consider allocating additional funds to the rental housing program so we can help these projects get to the finish line and continue our important work of building more affordable rental housing units across the state. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Appreciate your testimony. Jessica Zuniga. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Barnes, Vice Chairman Chang, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jessica Zuniga. I am the owner of Foundation Development Group, an affordable housing development company located in Howard County. I'm also the board president of the Maryland Affordable Housing Coalition. I'm here today in support of the governor's budget for the DHCD's rental housing programs and respectfully ask for your consideration of an increase of at least $33 million. As we begin to get back to business as usual from the pandemic, we are seeing that business has not returned to usual at all. The steep rise in construction costs and supply chain problems we experienced throughout the pandemic have not stopped. They've actually continued to accelerate. As a country, we are facing the highest inflation rate we have seen since 1982. Some of the hardest hit sectors are integral to development. As the Federal Reserve tries to curtail inflation, it continues to increase interest rates. These factors are coming together to create a crisis for development and specifically for affordable housing projects. Market rate rental communities have the luxury of increasing rents to raise more capital, but affordable housing communities may only charge a stipulated maximum rent, leaving them nowhere to go except state loan funds. The average affordable housing projects costs have increased from application to today by $3.6 million, or 11.7%. These increases are not just construction costs, but also time costs, primarily driven by longer construction periods due to labor shortages and supply chain issues. Our cost challenges are being exacerbated by rising interest rates, decreasing available mortgage proceeds. For every 25 basis point increase on one of our projects, we lose $600,000 in mortgage proceeds. Our state, through its generous support of the rental housing programs, has built a robust pipeline of needed affordable housing communities that cannot move forward without additional funding during this chaotic time. Many of the developers and businesses utilizing these programs, like mine, are Maryland-based and employ Maryland residents. A significant increase for the rental housing programs is necessary to continue our production of affordable housing and to support our affordable housing businesses. Thank you for the opportunity to express my support for additional funding for the rental housing programs.
Thank you, and thank you for your advocacy. Willie Moore.
Good afternoon, Chairman Barnes, Vice Chair Chang, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate your taking the time this afternoon. My name is Willie Moore. I'm president of Southway Builders. We're builders of affordable housing. We've been in business for 31 years, and our first project was an affordable housing project, and every year since we've been doing affordable deals. In my 34 years in construction, I've never seen conditions similar to what we're living through right now. I wanted to give you some examples of what's happening in the world of construction. Many of you may have heard of has been happening with lumber, but one example for one project, a 9% LIHTC or state tax credit project that was awarded in 2020. At the time of award, pricing for the lumber package for that job was $1.94 million. By September of 2021, it was up to $2.6 million. And by February of 2022, this year, it was up to $3.4 million. So overall, since the original pricing of the project, that one line item has increased by $1.4 million, which is a 75% increase just on that one line item. Within this year alone, in 2022, Firestone, one of the largest roofing manufacturers, has already issued 3 pricing increases. Rigid insulation, which is used on flat roofs of apartment buildings, we have between 6 and 12 month lead times that we're hearing about from suppliers. As of January of 2022, we were notified of a 30% increase for the cost of drywall by U.S. Gypsum. Concrete has seen almost 50% increases in rebar, 200% increases in wire mesh, and 15% in concrete materials alone. In years past, we grew accustomed to hearing about 3% increases, and now it's common to hear about 20% increases. So times really are unprecedented. We are here. I'm a member of the MAKE board, and I'm here, of course, to ask again that you please support the Secretary's budget and increase the Rental Housing Works funds as represented by Miranda and Jessica, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. And certainly this committee is well aware of the increase in construction costs. We've heard a lot about that this session, and I know it's something that's going to be on the front of our minds when we put our capital budget together. Are there any questions for any of these witnesses? Okay, with that, I believe that we are finished our business today. Thank you, subcommittee. Thanks to all the witnesses. Thanks for your advocacy. Everyone have a good night.